Morning, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. So, this is going to be the first part of me reading the manifesto book. And it's still covered in Raffaello chocolate because I had a lot of that shit yesterday. Anyway, I'm going to be reading this. I am going to be reading over pages one and a half or something like that, or two. I don't know how many pages I read off the top of my head. I think it was up to about 2.5 on here. So I am going to read what I feel like is an appropriate amount in the time given, and then I shall leave it at that. But for those who weren't in my live stream where I was reading out the instructions, I will read this as well for the sake of convenience, so you can hear what's going on. And the only time I'm going to pause is either to clear my throat or have a drink. So let's begin. This book is an anti-fascist book. We spend most of this book exposing how the power of a fascist state works. There is only one essential quality of fascism. It is the belief that the state and the powerful groups connected to it can and should control the actions of the individual citizens, i.e. restrict or compel your speech acts, restrict or compel commercial transactions, etc., etc. But fascism disguises its tyranny by claiming to care for the welfare of the masses. The military uniforms of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler are incidental to fascism. The fascists who run Britain need the public to think that military uniforms, silly gestures, and their little moustaches are essential parts of fascism. Fascism is a form of collectivism. It creates an us, the collective, and fascism directs hatred from the collective towards a them, the other. In the case of Britain, the hated group is the white working class, the indigenous people. Whilst the fascist state is an alliance of corporations and all the mascot groups to which the fascist state gives privileged status. We are sure there are hundreds of items of information in the book which will be new to you, because the state and its employees have been deceiving the public for decades. We will show you even before 1920, Britain was the inspiration for Mussolini's fascism. After reading this book, the systemic lunacy, what happens is I keep backtracking by accident. Anyway, after reading this book, the systemic lunacy seen in the West in the past 50 years will make sense. The left correctly accused fascism of being unprincipled, and the left know this because fascism is a product of the left. Fascists were Marxists, who saw that the cult of revolutionary communism would fail, so they adapted Marxism and formed fascism. Fascism is the combination of socialism with big business, with politics controlled by a single party. It is easily demonstrated that throughout the West democracy, it's a deception, concealing the small elite who really wield power, where each new government simply carries on with the policies of the past government. This single consensus party in each country, pretending to be different parties, brainwashing the public and criminalising dissent. In 1997, Britain's Socialist Party began the project of replacing the indigenous people in 2010. Britain's Conservative Party took over and increased the pace at which the socialist project of population replacement was to be conducted. The fascist state disguises its tyranny by pretending to care for the masses and bribing groups of people, and by directing hatred towards designated groups. The fascist state cannot tolerate dissent or individual freedom. Individual freedom is the opposite of collectivism. See Appendix 9 for a quick overview of the difference between collectivism and individualism. The fascist state decides what is true and what is false, what has value and what has not, what does not, rather. Reality is irrelevant to fascism because the fascist state legislates what is true and even legislates who is human. In the fascist state, a man with a ding-dong and a beard is a woman. War is peace. An aborted baby isn't human. It's an inconvenience to the mother, as a weed is an unwanted plant. Noise is unwanted sound. Hitler's Germany legislated certain humans were not human. Freedom is slavery. You're a criminal if you refuse to agree with that. What the fascist state dictates is the truth. A member of a privileged group can say, X is Y and I approve. But if a dissident says, X is Y and I disapprove, then he is a criminal. The fascist state criminalizes you for your attitude towards X and Y, even if the fact that X and Y is not in dispute. In the fascist state, the vast majority of people have no influence on politics. If they become loyal members of the consensus party and work their way up, they might have some input. In the July 2024 election, Sir Keir Starmer, I'm not going to call him Sir Keir Starmer, I'm going to call him what I've always called him, Keir the Traitor Starmer. In Britain, Keir the Traitor Starmer's Socialist Party got 33.7% of the votes cast and 290 MPs more than his nearest rival. In the 1932 general election in Germany, Adolf Hitler's Socialist Party got 37.3% of the votes and 100 MPs more than his nearest rival. A shocking comparison, but if you can confirm the German election results in the book of Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power. So in that 1932 election, Mr. Hitler's Socialist Party got far more votes than Keir the Traitor Starmer's Socialist Party ever did in 2024. But Germany's electoral system was far less rigged than Britain's. No overwhelming majority of legislators for Mr. Hitler, unlike for Keir the Traitor Starmer. In Britain, people are harder to say Britain is a democracy. The fascist state dictates what is true, even when it is the manifest that the majority of those who vote end up ruled by those they did not choose. Within weeks of Traitor Starmer taking power, his bureaucrats were threatening people around the world with extradition and jail if anyone should criticise and expose the facts about the state of the UK. The state-approved journalists were encouraged the fascist state to ban companies in other countries who facilitate free speech. In reality, even those companies limit free speech and thus control the act of individuals. In recent years, when an independent TV station started in Britain, which championed free speech, the fascists successfully targeted large corporations to ensure the corporations did not place adverts with the TV station in an attempt to drive it out of business. Under fascism, no independent thinking is permitted. No free speech or dissent is forbidden. Manifesto was finished just before the 2024 elections, which once more made Labour, or New Labour, the government, and the violent events of the months earlier were not obvious to the majority of people. Oh, sorry, I've skipped a line now. And the violent events following weeks led to us to update some of this book. Things we had thought months earlier were not obvious to the majority of the people had suddenly become obvious to them. While we start our book by defining fascism, note that in the hundreds of thousands of condemnations branding the working class as far right, the lying news media never define the ideology supposedly shared by these ordinary people by being smeared by the corporate organs of the fascist state. Because the far right of the fascist state, of its employees and its corporations, is a myth, the sole purpose of which is to herd the public away from noticing that the state is itself fascist. Where am I? Those using the concept of this mythical far right are simply the guard dogs of the fascist state. Quite fitting, actually. Anyway, the elite might as well just describe the working class dissidents as the scum or the subhumans, because the elite do not even have the integrity to ask those smears, what are your views? The elite never define their terms of abuse, nor demonstrate that the dissidents even agree politically on anything very much. It is all about herding the rest of the public down the tracks that benefit the fascist state. The same elite will bend over backwards to be respectful to Muslims, blacks, transgenders, etc., etc. But the elite has nothing but contempt and smears when the indigenous people resist the fascist state. Politicians, police, and the news media of the fascist state will work with and praise unelected immigrant community leaders. But when it comes down to the indigenous working class, they are to be voiceless, leaderless, and abandoned. Violent conflict is what the fascist state wants, because such violence allows the fascist state to extend its power. You shouldn't rise to the bait. You have to be clear about who is responsible for what is going on. We will show you better tools to defeat the fascist state. But first, we need to go over some history to ensure you understand your situation. You need to get informed and get organized. Violence is pointless. Expressing rage on social media is pointless. In the fascist state, everything is regulated by the government. This maze of red tape is something that hampers small businesses and so gives big corporations, large corporations a competitive advantage. I'd skip the line again. So big, government and big corporations work hand in hand together to further and to protect their incestuous exploitation of the public. Notice how virtually every politician, stroke number one, virtually every politician is intimately connected to big business, trade unions, middle-class professions, universities, etc., etc. How much of your economic activity is paying money to large corporations? Seriously. Reflect on how little of your expenditure is with a small business, as it is as much as 5% of your spending that goes to a family shop or a market stall, etc., etc. On the whole, the big corporations and the fascist state are united. The exceptions are very rare, and when Elon Musk announced that he would have a live interview with former US President Donald Trump on X, unelected dictators of the EU wrote to Musk, warning him, an American and one of the richest men in the world, of the things he must not permit the people in the EU to hear Trump say. Never mind that European citizens have no say in how USA is governed, because they also have no say in how the EU is governed. These dictats, or maybe I was right first time, to Elon Musk from an unelected EU bureaucrat were made under threat of economic sanctions from the EU. Does that sound democratic? It sounds more like the mafia's famous threat, nice business you got there, it would be a pity if someone were to set fire to it. A week before the announcement of this interview, Musk began legal action against an international cartel of advisors and global corporations, where Musk's legal action complained these global corporations had conspired to drive Twitter out of business. Twitter was not censoring the individuals that the fascist governments wanted to be censored. When you buy a bar of chocolate or get some laundry detergent or some toxic margarine or some shampoo or some coffee or some diabetes-inducing fizzy drink, do you imagine you are funding global corporations who are in bed with the fascist state? Well, you are. And this is going to be an eye-opener for me. No more chocolate? Oh, God, that's a terrible thought. Anyway, many of the global corporations who worked alongside Hitler are still selling you products. It's just that they are now in bed with a less overt form of fascism, a fascism without the obviousness of leaders wearing military uniforms. The fascist state rules through fear, bribery, extortion, and brainwashing. People live in fear that if they speak freely about how they see things differently from the fascist-approved narrative, these individuals will be punished by the state or by their employer, or by people in their vicinity. How many people do you know who live with these fears? When we published Muhammad's Quran in 2017, Tommy Robinson, we met people who told us they were terrified to be seen holding this book. The fear of the fascist state extended not to what they were saying, but what others might assume they were thinking. No wonder they were terrified. The fascist state had banned every single attempt at a book launch. Shortly after publication, Muhammad's Quran was banned by Amazon, eBay, etc., etc. The fascist state and global corporations working together to crush freedom of speech. You might think that the anti-fascists would call out the fascist state, but you'd be wrong. They are paid agents by the fascist state, paid to make the public think the fascists are elsewhere, other than right in front of your eyes. The state funds them through tax exemptions and massive free fake PR in the media. In 2007, Jonah Goldberg published Liberal Fascism, where he explained in great detail the fascist alliance of the left and corporations in the USA. But the virtue signalers have ensured the book is not remembered because it exposes their leftist alliance with fascism. The mascot groups allied with the state received special treatment. For 50 years, groups of Muslim men were allowed to rape thousands of English schoolgirls. Those weren't failings by police, courts, charities, schools, etc., etc. The rapes were deliberate policies being implemented by any state employee who went against the policies would be punished. Those who conformed with the policies would be promoted. When racist anti-white mobs damage historical monuments, this resulted in the police and senior politicians kneeling before the mob. Such violence by state-approved thugs was also worshipped in fascist Italy, in Hitler's Germany, and in Lenin's Russia. When anyone in Britain would say, "But white lives matter too," the institutions of the fascist state would pursue such statements as hate crime. In the fascist state, statements protesting that white people should be treated equally to black people are hate crimes. But violence by supporters of BLM is to be worshipped. Just one example of two-tier policing. Someone English posting something on Facebook that foments violence is jailed, but the state funds the distribution of books commanding that non-Muslims should be killed. Another example of two-tier policing, not one Muslim was jailed during the years in which Muslims marched around England saying, "Kill Salman Rushdie." Dozens of white people in Britain have been murdered by immigrants, but all of their names are forgotten. But the name of Stephen Lawrence is to be remembered forever. White people have defended themselves from violence from immigrants, only to find the white victim is jailed for racist violence. The two-tier policing is endemic, because the anti-white racism has been built into the legal system since the 1960s. It's demonstrable that the mascot allies of the fascist state receive preferential treatment in wider society. This will be a timeline now. 2001, Director General of the BBC. BBC is hideously white. He's also hideously middle class and hideously leftist. Those characteristics are not the target of contempt. 2005, Socialist Tony the War Criminal Blair. Government criminalised religious hatred. Yet Muslims were promised that despite years of terrorist violence caused by the Quran's multiple commands to kill the unbelievers would never bring prosecution to Muslims. 2010. Conservative government was in power when the Equality Act became law, creating the legal category of protected characteristics, mascot groups, allowing discrimination against the majority in favour of these mascots. 2016. BBC offering ethnic schemes is the right thing to do. 2023. RAF diversity targets discriminated against white men. 2023 again, MI5 giving internships to everyone except white people. 2024, employment judge rules 3 police officers were directly discriminated against when the force appointed an Asian sergeant. And these known cases are the tip of the iceberg of discrimination in favour of the mascot groups. Notice how it's the institutions of the fascist state that lead the way in racist discrimination against the indigenous population. Police forces are known to have a policy of deliberately ignoring racist violence against the indigenous people, and naturally the journalists have no interest in reporting on this scandal. A classic point to say, but of course the mainstream media won't tell you this. You know the drill, folks, because say it with me. It doesn't suit the narrative. Back to the book, though. These are examples of the official policies of the political class and its institutions. See Chapter 5.4. In private corporations and public bodies, employees are also subjected to unconscious bias training, which is just another name for the programs of political re-education, aka brainwashing, found throughout the history of fascism and communism. In the fascist nations of the liberal West, these re-education camps have been farmed out to big businesses. Clearly, the state-controlled media and state-controlled schools and universities are not brainwashing people fast enough to keep up with the cultural destruction caused by the elite? Do you think any of the mascot groups are forced to confront and recant their conscious and unconscious prejudices? In Islam, non-Muslims are regarded as najis, essentially and fundamentally dirty. We are put in the same category as feces and dead bodies. An Islamic expert professor, Michael Cook, says in a published book by Oxford University Press, non-Muslims whose impurity is irremediable, short of conversion to Islam, should never touch the Quran. Peter McLaughlin discovered this 20 years ago when his Muslim friend told him that any non-Muslim who touches an Arabic Quran contaminates it, and that Quran must then be burned. This is one of the standard Islamic ways to dispose of a contaminated Quran. This disgust Muslims have for non-Muslims is understood and acknowledged by the fascist state, because in parliament and courts of law, we dirty kafar are not to touch the Arabic Quran. The government's employees are forced to wear gloves, or the Quran will be in some wrapper, or the Quran left on a table for the Muslim to touch. When police in the UK are trained, part of their training is to instruct them not to touch the Quran, because they, as kafar, are permanently unclean and disgusting to Muslims. The oath is taken on the Quran, which should be kept in a cloth cover and unwrapped by the follower of the faith. Moreover, the fascist state stipulates that only an Arabic Quran can be used for legal purposes. The standard legal textbooks on English law say no oath taken by a Muslim is valid unless taken on a copy of the Quran in Arabic. In the fascist state, the courts deem inferior and dirty the kafar employee who hands the Muslim terrorist an Arabic Quran. The non-Muslim must wear gloves so that the Muslim terrorist is not disgusted by one of us dirty kafar, the people he just slaughtered. The fascist state knows that if a non-Muslim touches an Arabic Quran, that Muslims will be furious, because we dirty kafar have contaminated the Quran. That Quran can no longer be used by the Muslim who is sworn in as a member of parliament or as a lord. Do you think that the bishops in the House of Lords did not know this aspect of Islam? The example with the Quran is not the only example, of Muslim contempt towards non-Muslims. When Muslims pray, they must recite, as in they absolutely must, recite Surah 1 of the Quran, and those 5 verses tell Muslims not to behave like Christians or Jews, as books by devout Islamic scholars explain. The daily prayers of Muslims are invalid unless the prayers include this denunciation of Jews and Christians. Can you imagine the scandal if Christian churches said you must denounce Muslims or your prayers are worthless? But of course, mascots are not required to confront their biases, unconscious or very much conscious and explicit. The brainwashing of the fascist state is only aimed at those who are to be dominated, the indigenous people. The views of the mascots are to be worshipped as diversity. The Islamic contempt for non-Muslims is a protected characteristic under the UK Equality Act. Don't expect the Christian or Jewish clergy of the fascist state to tell the public that we are being denounced in mosques on a daily basis. After all, the religious hatred criminalised by the fascist state deliberately permits Muslims to hate non-Muslims, a hatred demonstrated by the doctrines and history of Islam. In Canada in 2019, posters appeared on streets saying Islam is right about women. They were denounced as far-right hate crimes. But a Muslim can say the same thing about women with nothing but approval from the authorities. For example, Wikipedia notes that in Islam, the opinions and observations of one man are worth those of 2 women. In texts which are the basis of Islam and which cannot be questioned by Muslims, the founder of Islam declared that women are deficient in intelligence. Since demented feminists support Islam, you might be led to agree that Islam is right about women. Only a demented person would support an ideology that makes them a second-class citizen. Phrases like far right and hate crime are simply means by which the guard dogs of the fascist state control the public. We get it. There is no equality in a fascist state. There is no rule of law. The mascots of the fascist state are above the law. Those who oppose the fascist state are just scum who can be slandered by however the elite chooses. There is no freedom of speech. The oppressed groups are criminals for saying the same things the mascot groups say. In the early days of Hitler's National Socialist Germany, Jews were at that stage, just singled out for the discriminatory treatment, stroke number 2. The methodical socialist genocide of the hated group came later. See chapter 5. In 2024, anti-immigration riots did come to England, just as Rachel Reeves had predicted 8 years earlier. And in those 8 years alone, almost 7 million more legal immigrants arrived in Britain. And who knows how many illegal immigrants arrived. Thus, at least 10% of the population of the UK came here in less than a decade. Did the politicians accept any blame for ignoring her warnings? When the riots happened, Reeves was a senior member of the new Labour government, which she had a huge number of MPs. A government which at least 80% of adult citizens did not vote for. See Appendix 8. In the fascist state, the elite brainwashed the masses to believe this is democracy. Keir the traitor Starmer's Socialist Party claims to represent the working class, but despises and persecutes the working class unless they're immigrants. The working class riots in the UK in 2024 started in Leeds, ironically the very town where Reeves is MP. But since that riot was largely immigrants being violent, the police ran away and left them to riot. It was reported that the state had tried to take some at-risk children away from an immigrant family, which resulted in rioting. The children were left with the family. Less than a week after the police ran away from rioting immigrants in Leeds, it was reported that a white soldier was stabbed outside his home in southeast England by a black man. As usual, journalists jumped to their standard routine, saying that the black man may have mental health problems, which is usually code for a Muslim, but he hasn't yet claimed allegiance to any known Islamic terror group. Couldn't put it better myself, actually, quite frankly. Anyway, we will have to wait months to find out if he was a Muslim, because the fascist state deception is everywhere. Less than a week after the attempted butchering of a soldier on his doorstep in the northwest town of Southport, it was reported that another black man killed 3 little girls and attempted to butcher 10 more, including other little girls. Since some protesters threw objects at a mosque, it's clear that they believed the killer was a Muslim. We will have to see in the months to come if the fascist state reveals that he was indeed a Muslim or not. The violence in Southport set off a spat of protests in 18 towns and cities across the UK, some which descended into riots. Often these were the towns where the fascist state had facilitated decades of Muslim gangs raping English schoolgirls. Suddenly, the police didn't run away in these towns where the indigenous people were protesting. Instead, the police were present in heavy-handed riot gear, and the journalists and politicians rushed to label these protesters as far-right racists. The indigenous people protesting about the immigrant mascots butchering white soldiers and white little girls is met with the jackboot of the state. But when immigrants resist this stroke number 3. But when immigrants resist the state, the police run away. The mascots get gentler treatment than do the indigenous people, because mascots groups have protected characteristics. It's increasingly obvious that the far right is code for a white person who offers some resistance to the fascist state. Ironically, the fascist state's systematic use of far right is a dog whistle they use to get their sheepdogs to herd people away from any resistance to the fascist state, so the fascist state can hide in plain sight while it denounces the opposition as far right. We are dealing with a political class who have institutional and generational knowledge on deception passed down through generations of this leftist cult. Since at least the times of Karl Marx, Yes, the fascists of the 1920s onwards were Marxists who didn't agree with Lenin, as we show in chapter 3.3. The fascist state in Britain even threatened to jail people who shared any photos or videos of the riots. The public are only allowed to know what happens when mediated by news corporations, which are agents of the fascist state. Translation: they don't want us to know about these things, they only want us to know what the media and the government wants to know. Weeks later, in trying to hunt down the far-right influencer who supposedly caused the riots by sharing false information online about the stabbings in Southport, it looked like the original source was a Muslim in Pakistan. Weeks before this discovery in Pakistan, the government-funded group Hope Not Hate, or again, maybe I was right first time, a state-funded sheepdog was quoted widely by the news media from the 31st July 2024 saying that following the murder of the little girls in Southport, and I quote, "The riot followed a blizzard of false information around the attack. Much of it circulated by far-right accounts online. This includes unevidenced claims that the attacker is an undocumented recent arrival from cross-channel migration and or a Muslim, that the attack was anti-white in its motivation." End quote. How ironic should one of the state's mascots, a Pakistani Muslim, be the far-right account the fascist state was looking to blame for the riots? Presumably, the journalists who identified this Muslim had set out to show that misinformation was created by someone they could connect to Tommy Robinson. On the 10th of August, it was reported that a naive 55-year-old woman in Cheshire was arrested for sharing this misinformation that apparently originated from a Muslim in Pakistan. Yet a few days later, before she was forced to make an apology for falsely claiming that there had been an acid attack on a Muslim woman in a town of England, his false claim was seen by 100,000 people. He wasn't some naive woman, but is the secretary of the state-funded anti-fascist organisation which he created some 20 years ago. Before that, he'd worked for most of the major TV news channels as a reporter. Lowell's is listed as the secretary of both the limited company corporate body trading with the name Hope Not Hate and the secretary of the charity corporate body trading with that brand. On the boards of his company and charity have been the great and the good, MPs, lords and imams, etc., etc. There are many such ideological institutions funded by the fascist state using tax exemptions. See chapter 5.2 for a discussion of another one. The financial accounts of Lowell's organisations release as little financial information as possible, yet in 2021, from about £1 million in charitable income, most of the revenue went on staff costs, 13 employees. In 2022, the charity, exempt from state taxes, paid out nearly £500,000 to the limited company. It's perfectly imaginable that Lowell's draws a salary from both the charity and the company. Yet there was no rest for the false tweet of this well-connected, professional state-funded activist whose entire business is supposedly opposed to people stirring up hate, but clueless members of the public walk into a trap. It pays to be part of a network of politicians and journalists if you're going to be making false claims that might incite hatred or violence. But there's no two-tier legal system in the fascist state of Britain, is there? Even if the fascist state doesn't go after a dozen influencers or a few hundred people, a few hundred people who share the evidence the fascists seek to suppress, the rulers have achieved their goal. The vast majority have been further coded by the fascist state. As Amnesty International said in 2015 of East Germany's Stasi, and I quote, the last one, and I'll be ending the video. I didn't think I'd only be reading 10 pages, but hey-ho. Like the USA and the UK, who today intercept our emails and internet records, The Stasi sought to infiltrate personal life, to collect intimate information about people's lives, to identify those they consider a threat. The Stasi surveillance network spiraled out into every aspect of daily life. Among an estimated 274,000 employees, there are at least 174,000 informants, which would have been about 2.5% of the working population. Informants snooped in every office, cultural and sporting society, and apartment building. They recorded people in their own homes and in the homes of their friends.